Let's start looking at a small office that is perhaps staffed with professional uh, employees. For instance, accountants, insurance agencies, some form of professional environment. Need not be Class A office space. Could be retail office space, but it's not doing retail type of work. It's doing some form of professional work. Okay. I always find it important to have a rack. That's this metal cage that any wiring vendor will be able to mount on a wall somewhere. And the most common place to mount this is near the MPOE, or the main point of entry, which is a telecommunications term indicating the place where data services and telecommunication services are delivered to the building. Now, if you operate in a facility that is a suite of offices, this may or may not be within your suite. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. If it isn't in your suite, then you just need to find some location where the internet service provider is going to be delivering their service, and then you could have the wiring vendor put a rack on the wall for you. That's the metal box. Then what you're going to need is what's called a patch panel, because unless you're going to be doing complete Wi-Fi, and even if you are, because the Wi-Fi devices themselves need Category 5 cables run, you'll need a patch panel. And normally this is provided by a wiring vendor. With a floor plan, you could do a markup indicating where you want your data jacks to exist. Hand that off to a wiring vendor for a scope of work. They could provide you a quote, and then they could proceed to run the data cabling, or what's known as structured cabling. That would go into a patch panel. I always like to put mine at the top just because their wiring typically comes through a drop ceiling and into a patch panel, and then that wiring is not cluttering up the rest of the rack. You also need an Ethernet switch if you're running Wi-Fi access points. This will provide the PoE, or Power over Ethernet, for your wireless access points. You can get them refurbished or used off multiple different sources. If you do, just make sure that the PoE that is going to provide is going to be sufficient for the wireless access points that you're going to be using. There's several different PoE standards. PoE AT, I think, is the most recent. Actually, there's one that's D something, which is the new one, which is 90 watts of power per port. And basically the use case there is that each port could be used to power building lighting. That's one of the new use cases, or signage, like little LCD, or actually pretty big LCD screens that are around a office can be powered off the switch, because you got 90 watts of power coming off each port. Anyway, patch panel then runs into the Ethernet switch. So the structured cabling goes throughout the office. I like to use little 6-inch or 1-foot patch cables to make it nice and neat and easy to trace back to the patch panel. And from here, you're going to connect to the wide area network device. Could be a firewall, could be a cable modem. It depends on what type of use case you're going to be operating in, whether or not you're a branch office for a larger enterprise or you're a standalone small medium business. That will determine what this device is actually going to be. Generally, switches come with uplink modules. I uplink the WAN port into my switch in an uplink module. The reason I do so is because the hardware of the switch actually is different for these ports here. These ports are actually sharing bandwidth, and these ports are sharing bandwidth. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a grouping of ports that share bandwidth. In more expensive switches that are used in data center environments, they're called non-blocking switches, where every port has full bandwidth to the backplane. These access layer switches that are commonly used have shared bandwidth among multiple different ports, but in the uplink module they do not. So I always uplink my WAN into one of the uplink ports. Next, you'll need some form of telecommunications, and what's shown here is something called ShoreTel, which has been purchased by a company called Mitel, and that will typically connect to RJ11's patch panel, which you'll receive your telecommunication service typically from your cable company, or your local telephone company will provide ports to connect your telephone system to, and then you'll just connect them to these ports down here, connect to your telephone system, and your telephone system will connect to the switch if your handsets are voice over IP. Typically they are nowadays. The last thing that's in the rack is this device down here. Is called a power distribution unit. It looks like, just a typical surge protector, but they're made for racks where you can screw them into place. If you look at the little plug, it's got a little side blade plug. That's a NEMA 520 outlet, and very common in commercial environments. Outside of the rack, a UPS for what I call conditioned power. Conditioned power is important because all these devices are sensitive to electrical fluctuations. They can survive it. However, having conditioned power ensures longevity and also the ability to sustain brownouts and short-term blackouts. This device will connect to the wall, and then the power distribution unit will connect to the UPS. I also always buy UPSs that have a management Ethernet port, because the Ethernet port allows you the ability to look administratively into the health of the UPS. These devices, the batteries, have a shelf life typically of 3, 4, maybe 5 years. So you do need to keep an eye on that, and it's much easier to do so remotely if you have a management interface. Also, this one shown has what's known as an I/O port. Devices for information technology sometimes are environmentally hardened, and sometimes they are not. When things get too hot, they can shut themselves down as a self-preservation mechanism. It's not uncommon for offices to have the air conditioning turned off on the weekend. So normally when I put in a UPS, I also put in a temperature probe in order to graph that over time. And if over the weekend it gets to be 95 because the switch is churning out a lot of hot air that's not getting cooled, then we need to talk to the landlord of the facility to see if there's some way that the HVAC can be adjusted. The temperature sensor, management port, conditioned power, PDU, WAN services, RJ11 patch panel, telco, Ethernet switch, structured cabling patch panel, and rack.